There we are. All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here today. I'm Alex Bertolucci, the Oregon Communications Manager for Circular Action Alliance. Today is the third webinar in a series of webinars about the different sections of the Oregon Program Plan. And I am very excited to report that the Oregon Program Plan was approved officially last Friday by the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. This marks the first approved program plan in the United States for packaging EPR, or extended producer responsibility. So this is a huge milestone. And all of you who are producers or educators, local governments, any part of the chain were all instrumental in making this a success. So a huge thank you for all of the time and energy that you've put into making the Recycling Modernization Act what it is and getting us to this milestone, and all the time and energy you'll put in to continue this moving forward. During today's webinar, I will provide an overview of the program plan's Education and Outreach, or E&O section. CAA has 2 other webinars left in this webinar series, and you can find more information and register for those at the link that I just dropped in the chat. For today's webinar, all attendees are in listen-only mode. You're not able to turn on your microphone or camera. You just get to hang out and listen and learn. You can also use the chat and the Q&A. And if you could put all of your questions into that Q&A that you can find in your Zoom toolbar. That just helps me keep track of what questions are being asked and making sure that I can get those answered. While I introduce you to who CAA is, I'd love to see who's actually here today. So if you could take a minute and use the chat, let us know your name and organization you represent. While you're doing that, here's a quick look at what we'll cover today. As you can see, you'll learn a bit about who CAA is, see an overview of E&O in Oregon, take a closer look at the E&O brand, review the different batches of materials that'll be coming out, look at some timelines, and then we'll spend some time answering questions. Before we get into the webinar, I just always like to take a minute and remind folks who CAA is. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to implementing effective packaging extended producer responsibility, or EPR laws in the United States. CAA was founded by the 20 member companies shown here, and these founding members provide CAA with startup capital and continued oversight and governance. However, because CAA is the sole producer responsibility in many states, we're committed to working with the thousands of member producers obligated under EPR laws. CAA's mission is to deliver harmonized, best-in-class compliance services to all producers to advance an efficient and effective circular economy. We will meet state regulations, build on existing systems and structures when possible, and work with interest holders across the system to advance environmental outcomes of covered products. In Oregon, we're also focused on ensuring local governments, service providers, and community members have the tools, resources, and funding available to successfully implement the RMA. This is our last slide before we get into today's topic. I want to introduce you to the Oregon team, and we've been growing rapidly here in Oregon to make sure that we have the folks on board for implementation. Since the last webinar, we've actually added 2 new folks, but I didn't have time to get our newest one on the slide today because she just started. So Matt Francis there is our materials management lead, and Crystal Moore is going to be joining us to work on the PRO Recycling Center rollout. So 2 new folks since the last webinar. Like I said, we're growing rapidly to make sure that we have the folks on board that need to be here. And the Oregon team deeply understands the recycling and waste system and is already putting that experience to good use as we approach the launch in July. All right, now let's turn our attention to what we're here to talk about today, education and outreach. Starting at a very high level, E&O for the Uniform Statewide Collection List and the PRO Recycling Acceptance List will be coordinated, developed, and printed by CAA and our partners. These E&O materials will help the public understand what they can recycle, how to prepare that for recycling, and where to take it, and a lot more. CAA has a big task with E&O in Oregon. This slide shows our three main objectives. First, our audience is large. We're trying to reach 4.2 million people across 1.6 million households here in Oregon. Add on top of that about 120,000 businesses, organizations, and institutions, and that's a big lift. Luckily, we aren't doing this alone. Local governments, service providers, community-based organizations are all part of the plan to help educate the state. And we have some really amazing contractors on board who are helping us develop these materials like the Recycling Partnership and C+C. Our second objective is to create materials that meet the needs of Oregon's population. This means creating, translating, and transcreating materials to reflect different communities. Oregon is a big state with very different areas and different needs. We want to create E&O materials that account for the needs of rural and urban communities, as well as different abilities and languages. And lastly, CAA will create a statewide promotional campaign that shares information about the new law, what's changing, and why recycling is important. And we're going to hear all about these different parts and pieces in just a little bit. On the last slide, I was talking about the statewide promotional campaign, but that's only part of the E&O equation. You can see this Venn diagram here shows two parts of the E&O ecosystem and where they overlap. First, we have the localized instructional materials in the blue oval. The main users of these materials are going to be local governments and service providers. These materials include the recycling guide, educational cart tags, newsletters, posters, and so much more. The instructional materials answer the question, how do I recycle properly? The green oval is the statewide motivational campaign that CAA will deploy. This campaign could include print, radio, video ads, social media, billboards, and on and on. There's a lot of different options there. This material messaging will motivate people to engage with the recycling system, which starts with an awareness campaign. And both of these campaigns will overlap on the statewide website, where folks can get answers to recycling questions and learn more about what's going on. The website is not going to replace the websites of local governments, service providers, but will complement them by providing another trusted source for recycling information. We all share the same goal of ensuring our recycling system works and has low contamination. And we want to provide information to the public in a way that they want to and are ready to receive it, no matter where that information lives. Now let's turn our attention to the statewide education and outreach brand and talk about why we chose to create one. When creating the E&O brand, we first developed this set of brand attributes. We want the brand to be seen as reliable, trusted, empathetic, and bold. To achieve this, we collaborate with communities to deliver consistent information and build recyclers' confidence that their actions will lead to the right environmental outcomes. We must show that we're forging a modernized recycling future, leveraging our knowledge and insight to drive the change we seek. We can't call it the Recycling Modernization Act if we're not showing those things. Keep these in mind as we move through and take a look at that brand. On this slide, you'll see our brand platform. So the vision of the brand is for all Oregonians to fully participate in the recycling system. That's pretty straightforward. The purpose is to deliver better recycling and sustained participation in Oregon's recycling program. We know Oregonians enjoy recycling, like recycling, trust recycling, and we want to keep that strong trust and participation going. The mission is to make recycling easier, more effective, and equitable by providing Oregonians with convenient service and clear guidance so everyone can participate in the recycling system that works for all Oregonians that they can trust. And when we say equitable, we mean three things. First, geographic access. Whether folks live in an urban area or a rural area shouldn't change their access to the information that they're receiving. Second is transcreation and translation in local languages and delivery through relevant channels, ensuring we provide information in ways that meets the need of the people in Oregon. And lastly, ensuring both multi and single family access to recycling. As many of you know, access to recycling hasn't always been equal between multifamily and single family homes, but we hope to start closing that gap as we move forward. The brand promise is to provide Oregonians with meaningful, relevant support and information they need to consistently participate in a recycling system that works. And last but not least, we want to position the brand to represent a modernized recycling system that reduces confusion and recycles covered products in accordance with state law. The statewide brand that we're using is called Recycle On Oregon. You can see we also fully transcreated the brand into Spanish. So not just translating Recycle On, but looking at what that actual meaning is and how it would best transcreate into Spanish. This brand will be used on educational materials, in statewide ads, on the PRO recycling centers, and elsewhere. The brand name and logo were created with input from marketing professionals, Oregon service providers and local governments, and community members to help us refine and pick a brand and logo that really connected. The name Recycle On invokes forward movement with recycling and that focus on the future. It also builds on Oregonians' strong and, kind of first in the nation approach to recycling. You may be asking yourself, how does the Recycle On brand connect with the CAA brand? Here you can see the CAA brand will continue to be used when connecting with producers, governments, service providers. But for public-facing activities, the Recycle On brand will be used. For those of you in Oregon or familiar with Oregon's recycling system, this is a similar approach that the Oregon Bottle Bill took when the Oregon Beverage Recycling Cooperative, or OBRC, rolled out standalone redemption centers and bagged collections. Instead of naming that OBRC collection points, they came up with the name Bottle Drop instead. We believe the Recycle On brand will connect with the community and become a well-known brand and resource for recycling information. Let's turn our attention to the actual E&O materials and take a look at when the different materials are going to become available to folks that are using them. Education and outreach materials are going to roll out in 4 main batches you can see laid out here. The first batch was split into 2 sections, 1A beta and 1B. This was at the request of local governments and service providers to allow more time for them to plan and kind of get the better understanding of what's being created. Batch 1A beta was released in early February, and this included the recycling guide, material images, so actual images of what can be recycled, and terminology of what to call items. There was a recycling cart label and a sample newsletter article also in that batch. Batch 1B, still in that dark blue box, will come out in April and include a style guide and messaging timeline, as well as the finalized and translated Batch 1A materials. Batch 2, shown here in the gold, will come out in May and include more educational tools like brochures, postcards, billing inserts, and much more. There's also going to be a social media toolkit and sample press release. Batch 3 is the public-facing website that was in the middle of that Venn diagram earlier. This plans to launch in July. And batch 4 in the green box is the statewide ad campaign, that motivational part from the earlier Venn diagram, and that starts in August. All of these materials are developed with consultation and feedback from communities and the Oregon Recycling Council. I'd also like to thank the Recycling Partnership, CAA's contractor, for all of their work on the creation and educational materials. And I know some of them are on the call today, so special thanks to you all. The next few slides, we'll look at the batch 1A beta material released at the start of February to local governments and service providers. The recycling guide comes in two different forms to address two things. The guide on the left is for communities not collecting glass curbside and collecting a smaller list of metal items. The one on the right is for communities collecting glass curbside and a larger list of metals. Over time, the list of accepted materials should become the same as CAA works to on-ramp additional items to the uniform statewide collection list. These E&O materials will be accessible to local governments and service providers through an education and outreach portal. There will be dynamic features that users can edit to reflect the needs of their community. For example, at the bottom, you can see a placeholder logo, local website, and phone number. Those would be able to be edited so that the local government or the service provider could put their logo and contact information on this. The No section will also be dynamic, and communities can choose from a list of contaminants that we'll see on the next few slides that are most important to them. I will note that not all of these will be editable in the E&O portal right at launch, but design files and CAA support will be provided to ensure communities get the materials and the edits that they need to be able to educate their community on the USCL. Oh, got a little extra animation in there. Here's a closer look at the material graphics that were provided on those recycling guides. These are called photorealistic illustrations, or PRIs. The PRIs help folks think about the material that is recyclable, such as cardboard or plastic bottles, without connecting it to a specific brand and thinking only that brand is recyclable. Batch 1A also includes the label for recycling carts shown there, standardized terminology and newsletter text, as well as those 24 different contaminant icons that I mentioned earlier that go in the No section and are editable within the E&O portal. So communities can select up to 5 of these contaminants to put at the bottom of the guide. So if they're focused on batteries and garbage or diapers, they can switch those in and out of the materials that they're creating. Batch 1B is currently in the community consultation phase with 2 webinars this week. We just had one on Monday. We have another one on Friday. And the feedback survey is open to local governments and service providers to let us know their thoughts. The batch includes a messaging timeline guide and the community education and outreach playbook. It's also the style guide. Both tools are guides intended to help local governments and service providers plan when and how to engage with the community around the rollout of the RMA. As you'll recall, batch 4 is the motivational statewide ad campaign. At the end of 2024, CAA shared batch 4 campaign concepts and received feedback. C+C, the agency working with us on the statewide ads, incorporated that input, and I'm sharing this as a first look at the direction that those ads will move in and the messaging. Together, we can do this. So you all are the first ones to see this outside of CAA. Thanks for attending today. This is your little treat for that. Batch 4 is the last batch to launch, and we will have future engagement and time for feedback on those ads and the concepts. Let's shift gears away from the specific materials and chat about who pays for what when it comes to these E&O materials. The RMA requires PROs to allow communities to edit and access E&O materials. To accomplish this, CAA will launch that E&O portal I mentioned earlier. Communities can find the materials they need, make specific edits, and download for use or send to CAA for printing. CAA will cover the cost of printing materials based on per material and per household levels. What does that mean? So for example, a community could order 2 recycling guides per household per year. All of these quantities and much more are going to be spelled out in the printing guidelines document that will be released later this year. Some educators or local governments and service providers prefer to continue to use their own E&O materials and incorporate CAA's materials into that. The most common place we expect to see this is on multi-waste stream materials, like the example shown here from the city of Portland. If the recycling section meets all of the requirements outlined in the printing guideline, CAA could reimburse the community for that percentage of printing costs. So if you look at this example on the screen, the recycling section and the glass section take up, let's say about 33%, maybe a little bit more than that. CAA, if all of the conditions were met for us to cover that printing, could cover the cost of printing these materials so that the local government or service provider can provide that one single piece that also educates their community on garbage, compost, and other types of collection. I added this slide in because the $3 per capita contamination reduction funding is often confused with E&O funding, but they're not quite the same thing. This contamination reduction funding is available to all communities in Oregon to conduct contamination reduction activities. DEQ is putting together a list of approved activities that local governments and service providers can pick from to be approved activities and be reimbursed by CAA. The table at the bottom shows some E&O covered costs, such as the creation and printing of educational materials, while the $3 per capita funding is much broader and could be used for things like hopper cameras to identify contamination or lid flipping and cart tagging efforts. DEQ's the one responsible for developing the list of what is and isn't an acceptable activity. And if you have questions on what those are, I would recommend reaching out to DEQ, your regional specialist, or another contact. If you're not sure who to reach out to, feel free to give me an email and I'm happy to connect you. If you attended the last webinar in our series a couple weeks back, you learned about the PRO recycling centers, previously called depots, but we learned not many people know what depots are, so we're calling them recycling centers. Today, we'll look at some of the E&O materials that go into these. Just to refresh your memory first, there are 2 recycling lists. The PRO recycling centers will focus on the PRO recycling acceptance list, this one here, while the other materials that we saw today focus on the uniform statewide collection list. CAA plans to build out a network of recycling centers across the state over the first program plan period. Education and outreach materials will be developed to help the public find the recycling centers, know what they can recycle there, and how to prepare those materials for recycling. And more on the recycling center E&O is going to be available in the coming months as we move forward with those. And before we get to questions, let's take a look at a few slides showing some of the timelines that are coming up. The timelines for batch 1B and 2 are shown here. This week, there were those 2 webinars that I talked about. There was one on Monday, one coming up on Friday, for local governments and service providers to see those batch 1B materials and get a survey to provide feedback. These materials are going to launch in early April. In March, there will be 2 more webinars to review batch 2 materials and provide feedback for those local governments and service providers. And those batch 2 webinars will, or excuse me, those batch 2 materials will launch in mid-May. Batch 3 and 4 are still being scoped and some timelines being developed, but more information to come on these probably in the coming weeks, so stay tuned. And what can you do kind of as next steps? One, stay connected and provide your feedback on the E&O materials by attending those webinars and providing information on those feedback surveys. That's for local governments and service providers. So if you're one of those and you haven't been receiving emails from the Recycling Partnership or myself to be able to see those upcoming webinars, please reach out so that we can make sure you get on that list. And last, you can visit circularaction.org, go to the About, find the newsletter, sign up, and sign up for Oregon's monthly newsletter. We've sent out 2 so far. We send out 1 a month, so it's not too big of a lift. We're not going to spam you with newsletters, but it's a great way to stay in touch with what's going on here in Oregon. Lastly, I can't do a webinar right now without mentioning this. I think I heard earlier we are 33 days away from the reporting and registration deadline. So for any producers on the call today, your deadline to register and report to CAA is quickly approaching, and you don't want to miss this deadline. Your obligations don't go away if you don't register and report. However, you will be required to retroactively pay those fees. You could be subject to late charges, liquidated damages. We're also going to be putting a list of who's registered on our website, so you don't want to see your name showing up on the not registered list. So again, go to circularaction.org, click on the registration or the reporting link, and if you have questions, please reach out to our producer services team. They're there to provide assistance, support. They've got lots of tools and resources. So again, make sure you get registered today. Hopefully folks have gotten some new information from today's webinar. And before we go into questions, which I see we've got some already piling up in there, I'd like to just make one more plug for the other webinars in this webinar series. You can see future topics and dates at circularaction.org/events. I'll drop a link to that in the chat. The next webinar in this series will cover collecting and recycling the USCL materials, the Uniform Statewide Collection List. And all of these webinars run from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Pacific. Thanks for being here. I'm going to stop the recording so we can do some Q&A.